purchasing, possessing or consuming alcohol. And this is done by denying their sale from a takeaway outlet. So people who are a banned drinker for the period that they're on the register aren't able to purchase takeaway alcohol. And then also while they're identified as a banned drinker, there's this kind of encouragement that they do uptake treatment and rehabilitation. So it's kind of twofold in that we're reducing the alcohol-related harms, but also improving health and safety. And the way that the banned drinker register is enforced is that from the 1st of September 2017, every single person who goes to a bottle shop and purchases takeaway alcohol is required to produce their ID. So regardless of whether the person's 18 or 80, you have to show your ID. If that's scanned and it's sort of the cashier is alerted that the person's a banned drinker, they aren't able to proceed with that transaction. But if you go to the bottle shop and it identifies you as not being a banned drinker, you're fine to proceed with that transaction. Okay, so there's a number of different ways by which a person can find themselves on the BDR. So these involve any combination of 3 alcohol-related protective custody episodes or alcohol infringement notices in a 2-year period. Having an apprehension for an alcohol-related offence, so something like alcohol-related assault. Having an alcohol prohibition condition on a court or parole order, so that could be a bail or a domestic violence order, or it could also be someone who is in community corrections with the requirement they don't possess, consume or purchase alcohol. People can also self-refer to the BDR register for any reason. And people can also be referred by an authorised person. So what we're sort of focusing on today is more of those justice system pathways, so the protective custody episodes, infringements and apprehensions, and then briefly the court and parole as well. So as I mentioned, people are temporarily placed onto the register. So for people who come on for a court ban or like a parole ban or a health ban, the length of those bans is kind of situationally dependent. So, for example, if people will have different lengths of their community corrections order, that will determine how long their ban is. So this graph here refers specifically to people who come onto the BDR for a police ban. So if someone receives a police ban via like a protective custody, infringement or apprehension, they're initially given a 3-month ban. If they can complete or go through that 3-month period with no further alcohol-related contacts with the justice system, they'll exit the BDR. But if they breach this ban during that 3 months, they'll then go on for 6 months. If they breach this, they then go on for 12 months. And if that 12-month ban breach, it resets. So since the 1st of September 2017, we've had, there's some people that have gone on for a 3-month ban, completed that with no further events, and then exited. We've also, however, got some people who have come on sort of fairly soon into the picture and are still on the BDR at the current moment because they've continually had events breaching their ban and therefore resetting it. Okay, so in terms of the first year of implementation, so this graph here just sort of shows the number of people on the BDR at the end of each month from that September 2017 to August 2018 period. And the coloured bars there sort of depict the type of ban that each person was on at the end of each month. So at the end of August, we had about 3,682 people on the BDR, I think. And this number's sort of gradually been increasing since the initiative was rolled out as more people hit the required trigger events and become a banned drinker. And what we also know is that police bans are the most common reason for people going onto the BDR. With alcohol-related offences and protective custody episodes, the most common reasons. And then, so this graph here just sort of briefly shows the people on the BDR at the end of August 2018 by their sex and Aboriginal status. And what we've found is that 70% of the people on the BDR identify as male and 83% identify as Aboriginal. So we've got it's predominantly a male and a predominantly Aboriginal sort of population who are on the BDR. Okay, so the first research question we looked at was what type of alcohol-related behaviours people are showing before and then after going onto the BDR. Okay, Okay, so to do this, we used latent class analysis to identify similarities in people's behaviours before the BDR and then similarities in people's behaviours afterwards. So we did two separate analyses. The first, we looked at patterns of contact beforehand, and for this we had a sample of 6,234 banned drinkers, and this was people who had received one or more justice system bans in that first 12 months of operation. So this number's slightly higher than that previous graph because in that previous graph that was people currently on at the end of August, whereas this is people who have ever been on during that 12-month period. The second latent class analyses we did looked at patterns of contact after the BDR. So we had a bit of a smaller sample here, 3,408 people, as not only did they need to have received one or more justice system bans, so police or court or a parole ban, they also had to have had spent at least 180 days in the community after being banned. One of the things that we've found is that quite a number of people will have an alcohol-related apprehension, go on the BDR and then go into custody sort of almost at the same time as that ban starts. So for those people, they're not, if the duration of their ban is the same or less than their period in custody, they're not physically being impacted by that ban. So with this requirement of at least 180 days or 6 months in the community, we had a follow-up period during which we could be sure people they had the opportunity to have a contact. Okay, and so what we used for this analysis was 4 indicators of justice system contact. We had 2 non-criminal events. These were alcohol-related protective custody episodes, so someone who might be intoxicated is picked up by the police and taken into custody for the night just for their own protection, and also alcohol-related infringements. So that could be drinking in a regulated place, for example. We called these non-criminal events because these are the kind of contacts that don't require the person to appear before the court. And then the 2 criminal events we used were alcohol-related apprehensions and then also time in prison. And so if we look at the sample of people, of behaviours before the BDR, we found the best sort of fitting class. We found 4 distinct classes of behaviours, and these were all different in terms of their types of contact. So here we go. So the first group that we identified, this was 22.8% of individuals, and these people we called sort of non-criminal events, as they're showing up for protected custodies and infringements, but they're not typically having apprehensions and time in prison. And also interestingly, this was the group that we found to have the highest percentage of females. The second group we identified, these are kind of criminal and non-criminal event people. So these guys are having protected custodies and infringements at sort of a pretty low frequency, but they're also having apprehensions with addition of time spent in custody. So usually they're in custody for 1 or more periods before going on the BDR, and either side of that they're having criminal and non-criminal events. The third group, so this was really interesting. So this is 20.3% of the people, and we found that in that year before going on the BDR, this group typically weren't having sort of protected custody infringements. They were having apprehensions at sort of a pretty low frequency, but they were generally spending time in prison. And so what we figured out was that these guys were actually people who were going on for parole bans. So often these people haven't actually been in the community in that year before, haven't had the opportunity to have alcohol-related contacts. So the contacts that they're having that have put them on the BDR generally occurred more than a year before it was rolled out. And then the fourth group, these are low-frequency criminal events and no prison. So these guys were sort of not having protected custody or infringements. They were generally having a single apprehension because that's sufficient to trigger a ban, but it wasn't enough to put them in custody. So they're just having a single sort of apprehension in the year before, and this was almost half of the people that we found on the BDR. If we then sort of shift now to what we found in terms of people's contacts afterwards, again, a 4-class model was the best fit, and we've kind of found sort of pretty good similarities in terms of how we can, define the types of groups. So here we've got 15.1% of the banned drinkers. Oh, sugar. And these guys were criminal events, so they're having apprehensions with the addition of time spent in custody. The next group, these are criminal, non-criminal, so 7.4%, and they're sort of continuing to show up in the justice system after going on the BDR with both non-criminal and criminal type contacts. Group C, after the BDR, these people are continuing to show up, but for generally non-criminal types of events. And then the biggest group that we found, these individuals were showing no further events after going on the BDR. So, you know, at face value, this looks really promising, but it's actually really important to interpret this in context, which is where this snazzy little graph comes together. So if what we do is we read this from left to right, and it shows people's movements between the groups based on their contact, based on which group they were in before the BDR and their group after the BDR. And this is also restricted to those individuals who appeared in both groups. So people who were in that before group but didn't have sufficient follow-up days afterwards were excluded. So this is about 3,400 people, I think. And what we've found, oh, sugar, there we go. So if we look for the start here, people who were showing up before the BDR for predominantly non-criminal events, afterwards 40% of them were having, again, further non-criminal events, and 40% were having no further alcohol-related contacts. If we move down to these people, so these were the sort of criminal, non-criminal event type individuals beforehand. Sort of about a third of these continue to have criminal events, 26% continue to have criminal, non-criminal events, and then almost another third sort of had no further events after going on the BDR. When we looked into this a bit further, we found that the individuals in this group 2 tended to have quite sort of long histories of contact with the justice system in relation to alcohol. So it's not entirely surprising that within 12 months they haven't sort of started to show a reduction, but we do expect this is something that might occur over a longer term. The third group, or the third one here, the sort of, did it again, all right. These are the individuals on the parole bans. Not too surprising, 77% of these individuals had no further alcohol-related events after going on the BDR. And as we know from that previous slide, a lot of these individuals weren't having contacts before, so this is probably likely a continuation of that sort of, I guess, distance from the justice system. And then here, this was where we got the biggest movement. So 79% of people who were in that group where they had a single apprehension before the BDR were having no further events after the BDR. So what this is telling us is that this also is likely a continuation of the very limited or almost no contact that people were having before the BDR. And then the next research question we looked at, so that there explored sort of how the types of contacts they were having changed. We then went on to look at how the BDR reduced the frequency of people's contacts with the justice system. Okay, so for this, we used interrupted time series analysis to determine if that frequency changed after going on the BDR. But we had to impose a number of restrictions on the sample in order to measure this. So this sample included 906 banned drinkers. These people had to have had at least 4 days in that year before the BDR with an alcohol-related event. The reason for this is that we needed a sample who were able to show a change, whether that was in the positive or negative direction. We know a lot of people had very limited contact with the justice system beforehand, so they're not really in a position to kind of show a change afterwards. We also needed people who went on the BDR in the first 6 months of operation. That was to allow a sufficient follow-up time during which a change in frequency could be measured. And then we also required that the individuals in the sample had at least 21 consecutive days of their ban in the community. This was to ensure that the people in the sample hadn't spent the duration of their ban in custody. So we needed, by having this, there was, I think, at least 3 full weeks during which they were impacted by the ban in the community. So this was kind of a bit of a tricky one to do. So we created a variable which we called the event days per 100 opportunity days, and this was what we used to measure the rate of alcohol-related events before and after the BDR. So this was the number of people from the sample with an alcohol-related event on a given day over the number of people in the sample who were in the community and had the opportunity to have an event on that day. And the other thing, so someone asked a question in that previous presentation about what happens if you haven't got sort of an immediate change, and this is what we found here. So because we know that in order to go on the BDR, people have to hit a specific trigger event, we got that really big spike in the middle. And then because people need time for, they might go on the BDR, but they might still have alcohol at home. They're sort of, networks need to dry out per se. So there's also a kind of a lag in terms of when it begins to show any kind of effect. So what we did is sort of to bring this all together, we also needed, because people come onto the BDR on different days, so the policy came into effect on the same date, but if someone might have had an event in October, gone on in October, someone in November, so we aligned everyone on what we call T0, which was the date their first ban commences, and then for everyone we looked at sort of from T-365, which was 1 year before, looked at the contacts they had, aligned everyone there, and then up to the end of the follow-up period. And what this here shows, so this red dotted line is the rolling 7-day average of events per 100 opportunity days. This blue period here is the 2 months prior to the ban and the 2 months after their first ban. So we excluded that from the analyses coming up just because of the sort of non-linear trend. And then this orange line here is the best fitting line through the points. And so what we found is that before the BDR, this sample was having an average of 2.15 event days per 100 opportunity days. And then after the BDR, excluding this sort of 4-month period here, people were having 1.8 event days per 100 opportunity days. And then sort of, I haven't included any of the fancy sort of numbers here. We've got that in the appendix of the report. But what the interrupted time series or the segmented regression basically showed us is that before the BDR, there was this sort of slope here was non-significant in terms of the change, and there was also no immediate impact on event frequency. But in this period after going on the BDR, it's a small change, a small gradual change, but it was statistically significant. And so this was really useful, as it's telling us that people who are showing up in the justice system for a sort of moderate to high frequency of alcohol-related contacts, the impact of the bans is not likely to be immediate, but they are going to show a gradual decline over time. And then to kind of help this concept, or to explain this a little bit easier, we also created these profiles of people on the BDR. So we're quite fortunate up in the Northern Territory in that all our court corrections and police data can be linked, so we can sort of follow a person through. And so this here is a profile of one of the people on the banned drinkers register from a year before they went on the BDR to up to sort of a year after they've gone on the BDR. So this yellow period is their time on the register. And these lines here show the contacts that they had with the justice system in the year before. So this person was showing up on a pretty frequent basis. I think it was about 18 event days per 100 opportunity days in that year before. After going on the BDR, they've had a few contacts, had a period where there's no more contacts, and then they've continued to show up, but it's at a much reduced frequency than it was before. So I think this is about, that was about 4 event days per 100 opportunity days. So this is sort of an example of someone who has had a really high frequency of events beforehand, gone on, and then this frequency of contacts has reduced. But then on the flip side, we do acknowledge that there were some people in the sample who maintained a similar frequency of events while on the BDR as they did prior to. So for this individual, they've had sort of protective custody and infringement episodes. They've had a period in prison, and then they've had a few more criminal, non-criminal events, and they've gone on the BDR, and then these lines here are sort of, they're pretty much at the same frequency as they were before. So for someone like this, we expect that there's probably going to be, we're going to need longer than 12 months in order to show a reduction. Okay, so bringing this all together. So the analysis showed that alcohol-related contact with the justice system is the main reason for people becoming or being on the banned drinker register. And while some individuals have no further alcohol-related contact with the justice system afterwards, a lot of these individuals had very infrequent contact beforehand. And that's something that sort of is really important in the context of it, because we, without looking at what happened beforehand, we very could have interpreted what happened afterwards in the incorrect way. So that was really important. And then also what this shows is that the main impact of this policy is likely to be for individuals who have very frequent contact with the justice system before going onto the register. And while this group does appear to show a reduction in contacts, this is likely to be gradual rather than immediate. And then one of the other kind of limitations that we had with this analysis is that we are only able to sort of assess whether people's contact with the justice system has changed. One of the challenges that we have in the Northern Territory is that particularly so, for example, Tennant Creek, they've imposed quite sort of strict alcohol sort of restrictions there. It's the same distance from Mount Isa as it is from Alice Springs. So someone might not be showing up in the justice system, but they might have simply gone across to Mount Isa or left the Territory. And similarly, we recognise that people could be not showing up because they've moved to a remote place in the Territory or they're in hospital. So we really need, sort of moving forward, to do a lot more linkage to kind of understand and unpack this further. Because while we're showing that, you know, people are having reduced contacts, we don't know whether we can actually attribute that to a change in their alcohol-related behaviours or if it's due to something else. And this kind of quote here sort of exemplifies that, in that it's one of many alcohol harm minimisation policy initiatives, and it doesn't work in isolation. So it forms part of the contribution in achieving a healthier and safer community by reducing alcohol-related harms. So with more work around linkage and sort of, you know, moving forward and continuing to monitor these trends, we're hoping to be able to fill in some of the gaps and paint a much more comprehensive picture. But so far it's looking pretty good. Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Alana. We've got plenty of time for questions. We've got one from Don in the front here to start. You will, yes. Thanks, Don.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, look, you might have already covered this, but I realised they would have gone onto the register at different times, but well, certainly in this state, I imagine in the Northern Territory, there are strong seasonal effects on drinking.
Yeah, I think we did the rolling averages to try to control for that seasonality, but yeah, when we've got sort of the bigger ones, it does sort of change a bit, but...
So when did most of them, what time of the year did most of them go on the register?
Okay.
Can you remember that?
I think, I'll go back to that other slide. I know, so at the beginning we had a bunch of people who had preloaded bans, so people who were on parole and they sort of went on, and then so it kind of went up quite sharply at the beginning, because that's because we're starting to pick up all those frequent flyers, use that phrase, and then it's sort of starting, you can see now, to kind of plateau off, and we've already picked up a lot of the people who will be having really frequent contacts. So a lot of the people coming on now are sort of coming on for a single apprehension or something like that. So I guess, you know, when it becomes the dry season and we've got more of a sort of tourist or transient population, it could kind of go up again.
Right.
But yeah, it also changes depending on people, because people will go off the BDR and then they'll come back on. So yeah.
All right.
Does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, no, that's all right.
ACT, where I'm very envious of your whole stats unit. Can you just expand on the process that led up to this paper? Like, did you have a consultant in, or, you know, how did you go about planning the evaluation of the program?
Yeah, sure. So we, like, basically from the get-go, the minister was like, there's going to be a 6-month evaluation and 12-month evaluation. So our unit was responsible for the sort of justice side of that evaluation, and then health have taken on the sort of health side. So in the report, there was the link to that at the end. There is information about sort of what the health outcomes were. And so in terms of sort of how we did it, there was only sort of a small number of us because we had all that other ad hoc stuff going on as well. But we, basically sort of picked out the two. We used the key objectives, I think, in the original... I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, there was like a number of key objectives that they hoped to achieve with the BDR. So that's kind of what we talked to in this sort of first 12 months. Does that answer that question? Yeah.
So you didn't recruit outside help?
No. So Menzies are involved as well, because we needed some kind of external face on it being a public report. but they're going to be more involved. So I should also say this was part 1 of the evaluation. Part 2 will be early this year or sort of mid this year, and that's going to be more qualitative. So Menzies will take a sort of bigger role in that, and they're going to start doing interviews with people who are impacted by the bans, people who purchase alcohol from the bottle shops, licensees and so on. So yeah, there'll kind of be a bit more involvement from external then. And then I think they're also looking at some kind of linkage grant and yeah, because it's a pretty cool space.
Second question, what was the statistical test you used to establish significance of the trend going down?
At the end?
Yeah.
That was interrupted time series analysis. So we used segmented regression for that one.
And we've got another question down the front.
It's just a question about maybe your second stage of your evaluation, and if you're thinking about maybe perhaps some of the unintended consequences of a policy like this.
Yeah.
And we've certainly seen it in Queensland in some of the communities where they've got alcohol bans, where we've seen people introducing homebrew. It's quite toxic from what I understand in some of those places, and I could imagine you'd have the same sort of things where you might actually have people kind of bypassing your ban drinker system and kind of paying people additional money to access alcohol.
Yeah, so I think...
And I think your idea about tracking people that are moving is a very smart one too, because it's a very mobile community.
Well, I know, like, anecdotally, there's been reports of taxi drivers turning into, like, bottle shops on wheels and going through the bottle shops. And so they're sort of, they're introducing, I think, inspectors who are going to try to crack down on that. And they're also putting, they're slowly rolling out, I think, police auxiliary licensing inspectors, which are separate to sort of a general duties police officer, and they're stationed in front of bottle shops in Alice Springs, Catherine and Tennant Creek, I think, to sort of block some of the holes that way. But yeah, it's just, it's tricky because, people will switch from alcohol to mouthwash or something like that. And it's just, it's one of those things where you kind of have to do one little bit at a time. And yeah, so we do acknowledge that there are, you push down there and sort of that thing happens. And yeah, but it's kind of tricky because we're just working with the data. So I guess it's up to the police and the people on the front line to sort of figure out how to block those holes as well, yeah.
Thanks, Alana.